you.
Excellent. Cool. So good afternoon, everybody. I think I know pretty much everybody already. For those of you I may not have met yet, I'm Andy. I'm one of the retrieval regs. I previously worked with London HEMS and thought I'd share a little research stroke service evaluation project that I did during my secondment at London HEMS. My secondment was from October 2019, supposed to finish in April 2020, but extended just because of the impact of the COVID pandemic. And while working at London HEMS, we saw quite significant changes, obviously, within our taskings, within the nature of the jobs that we were going to, as the pandemic expanded and as lockdowns were enforced. So among the teams, our perceptions were that the number of call-outs that we were receiving were dropping quite dramatically. There was a sort of perceived increase in deliberate self-harm, in domestic violence, and there was a question of whether the severity of specifically these two etiologies was increasing as well. So I wanted to look at specifically how formally assess these perceptions. So I did a data trawl of our run sheets, the tasking sheets that the Emergency Operations Centre paramedic fills out, and within the database where basically the doctors complete the description of the jobs and the coding of the interventions that were performed. We looked at all activations, including cancellations, for the two periods. So the period immediately after the enforcement of the first lockdown in London, which was the 27th of March 2020, for 2 months following that, and then an equivalent period the previous year. I kind of wanted to do 2 years, 2 previous years, but I felt it was probably better just doing one. Sort of eliminates any changes or minimises the impact of any changes in service and things. But it also means that the weather is the same, or should be the same, which also has an impact on trauma epidemiology and incidence. So in general, looking at the service provision, with lockdown, the impact of lockdown, there was a dramatic and statistically significant drop in the number of activations that we were getting per week. So pre-lockdown meeting was 54 per week, and during lockdown that had dropped down to 32 per week. Dispatch criteria, so this is done on the judgment of the EOC paramedic, so an immediate activation would be something like fall from height greater than 20 feet, anything involving a train and such like. An interrogation is where the EOC paramedic assesses the call, interrogates the call, maybe asks the 999 caller some further questions and then activates. LAS, London Ambulance Service crews can request this specifically. Very, very occasionally they assist in secondary transfers and sometimes not documented, but not too often. No changes to the infill vehicle, the responding vehicle in terms of the rotary aircraft or fast response car. Mission distances travelled within cars was increased slightly, but that didn't reach statistical significance, with quite a significant jump in the spread of the data under lockdown. We don't document distance travelled in a helicopter. So aircraft landing sites, distance from the actual incidence. So we'd refer to under 50 metres as an alpha landing, Bravo landings 50 to 200 metres, and then greater than 200 metres, usually requiring a secondary vehicle from the police or ambulance service. And then again, there was no difference after lockdown in that instance. ambulance, and there's no change in the number of patients that we reached when they're on scene, as opposed to those that had begun transfer to the hospital, and then we rendezvoused with the ambulance in that instance. This is a sort of graphical representation of the impact lockdown had on our journey times. So this includes both aircraft and car jobs. This is 2020. This is a timeline for 2020, spanning the entire response time. This is 2019, the previous year. So at 9 a.m. originating call, there was a significant increase in the time to activation under lockdown. There was a significant increase in from activation to the engine start time. There's a significant decrease in travel time, in journey time for both cars and aircraft. There was a significant increase in the time it took us from stopping the vehicle to getting to the patient. And there was a significant increase in scene time as well. And then a significant decrease in the time it took for transfer to hospital as well. This combines sort of response time, so the time taken from originating call to getting to the patient, and there was a significant increase in that as well. So summary-wise, the mean time it took us to get to scene both reduced, both below 30 minutes, but there was an increase in time. There was an increase in 999 call to activation time, most likely due to the significant number of increasing number of EOC call volume. So with the pandemic, London saw an average jump from an average of about 5,099 calls a day to about 7,000 or 8,999 calls a day. So it was just more difficult for the EOC paramedic to filter through all those calls. We weren't roaming so much in the fast response cars at night to kind of try and keep social distance within the team as much as possible. So we were generally sitting around the 17th floor of Royal London a lot more, and it just increased the time it took to get to the vehicles. Reduced journey times, all vehicles, and that's mostly because, as we'll see later, that's due to the effect on the geographical changes in where the jobs were happening, where the incidents were happening. So helicopter landing sites were a lot more available under lockdown. And increasing scene times and increasing the time to get from the vehicle to the patients was deemed to be most likely down to the effects of having to don the PPE. So like I mentioned, the city area where this occurred where the jobs occurred had a significant impact on response time. So this is linear regression analysis looking at all the potential factors that impacted our response times. So if we look at all vehicles, so all missions from the 999 call to scene to accessing the patient, lockdown didn't have a significant impact after adjustment. Neither did time of the weeks, weekday versus weekends, or time of day. It's just down to aircraft were faster than car, obviously, and further out into the peripheries took longer than central areas. If we just look at car missions, so specifically just the journey time, not the whole response time, lockdown had a significant impact. So it reduced times for a given distance, and that was deemed to be down to quieter roads mainly. Other times include other effects was the time of day. It took a lot. It's a lot quicker to drive at night, obviously with the quieter roads, and again the longer distances travelled and the longer to peripheral areas and just the distance themselves. If we look at the jobs that we were cancelled on, there was no significant change in the numbers from lockdown as compared to no lockdown, but the reasons for cancellations were significantly different. There with a significant number of a doubling of the proportion cancelled due to recognition of life extinct by LAS crews that had already accessed the patient, so catastrophic injury basically. And there was an increase in the number that cancellations weren't documented in over 4 times, and again that's down to the massive increase in EOC workload. So to look at specifically the impact of the lockdown had on trauma epidemiology, we excluded all the cancellations, the 32 medical patients that we attended in those 2 time periods, 2 acute behavioural disturbances without injury, and they tend to be people having an acute psychotic event and wandering across train lines, because we always get activated to train incidents. There was 1 perimortem C-section, and that was excluded from the inclusion or the data group, and 1 patient had incomplete data. So the age of the patients significantly increased, at least statistically, probably not clinically significant increase, but again, I'll go into reasons for that later on. There was no difference in gender distribution, no difference in time of the week or time of the day, but there was a significant increase in the disposition as an exfil from the scene. Patients were no longer being carried in the aircraft due to concerns over contaminations, and so there was a significant change in the distribution there. But we were also pronouncing life extinct more often, with a 4% increase in that as well. So geographically, as I mentioned, there was an impact on the distribution between the various regions of London. So this diagram is based on postcode. So this area here is all the postcodes beginning with E for east, N for north, west, W for west, etc. all around this. And the grey areas represent central areas of London, with the blue areas being still within the M25, so still within metropolitan or Greater London, but not any of the central areas, so they have various different postcodes. If we look at the specific change in distribution within these postcodes, there's no significant difference. But if we just look at central versus peripheral areas of London, there was a significant move towards the peripheral areas under lockdown. Etiology-wise, there was a significant decrease in assault, going from 34% to 30%. There was a significant decrease in accident, i.e. RTAs, NVCs, etc. But there was a significant increase in the proportion of deliberate self-harm and domestic violence, with domestic violence increasing from 1% to 4%. What about severity? There was very little impact on severity or any of the different measures of severity, so no change in the median revised trauma score, no change in the numbers of patients with any critical organ failure, traumatic cardiac arrest, various other things remained constant. The rates of Reboa and thoracotomy were relatively static, but there was an increase in the number of trauma lines put in by twice as many, or 4 times the incidence, and that might just be down to variability in or an increase in uptake by our clinicians. But there was also a significant increase in the rate of blood transfusion, and my thoughts in this instance was that because we're treating less penetrating trauma, where the management, even with some significant degree of physiological impact, our approach would be a hypovolemic resuscitation, a permissive hypertension and just rapid transfer. Whereas under lockdown, because we're seeing more blunt polytrauma with potential for a increase in head injury, we may aim for a higher blood pressure, and we would have transfused more. And the patients were older as well, so we may consider underlying hypertension, etc., and so we may aim for a slightly higher blood pressure in those instances as well. So within the specific etiological categories, were we seeing more critically injured patients with after deliberate self-harm, or no, we weren't. There's no change in severity with an accident, interpersonal violence, or deliberate self-harm. The problem with domestic violence is even with the increase in numbers, there was there was still very low numbers, so no statistical modelling could be, or analysis could really be valid. But if just looking at the numbers there was no critically injured or patients in cardiac arrest before lockdown, but after lockdown there's 2 that were critically injured and 1 in traumatic cardiac arrest. So like I mentioned, significantly older, more in the peripheral areas, relative reduction in interpersonal violence and increase in domestic violence and deliberate self-harm. The severity was unchanged, but an increase in transfusion and trauma lines. So this is multinomial regression analysis to look at the various impact of the different potential factors influencing the etiology of the patients seen. So the reference category was accidental injury. The domestic violence was folded into interpersonal violence due to the low numbers, and this is compared across. So interpersonal violence was more likely to occur among male patients in the younger age brackets and at night. There was no impact of lockdown after adjustment for covariables, and deliberate self-harm, there was no significant association noted among the different variables assessed, including lockdown. This is just a summary. How about severity? So again, this is multinomial regression analysis. The table's on 2 slides, basically. Reference category is no critical injury, and in comparison to the critically injured, so those that were critically injured were more likely to have had a response time greater than 30 minutes. And they were less likely to have been injured during an assault. So interpersonal violence is less likely to lead to critically injured patients. Similarly, those in traumatic cardiac arrest were less likely to have been injured through interpersonal violence, and less likely to have been injured in an accident than through suicide. So suicide leads to greater numbers of traumatic cardiac arrest after adjustment for covariables. Again, lockdown had no impact on the severity of injuries measured in this way. So the response time less than 30 minutes among the critically injured is interesting, and the most likely explanation for this, it's not a causality thing, it's association. So the most likely explanation for that is that if patients are seen by LAS crews and are clearly minimally injured, they will just transfer themselves. Whereas if they require if they're critically injured and require a HEMS level intervention, they'll keep them going. So it just means that we had to drive further to intervene as required. critical injury is more likely after deliberate self-harm than assault, like I mentioned, and as mentioned, the traumatic cardiac arrest relationships as well. So there are a couple of weaknesses in this project. Obviously, it's difficult to say whether the relationships documented were as an effect of the lockdown or the pandemic itself. We only looked at the first wave, and so we weren't seeing the impact of prolonged restrictions. Actually, after we stopped recording, I had just moved to working as a trauma anaesthetist at the Royal London, and we did see ever increasing numbers of deliberate self-harm, which probably weren't captured in our data sets. We also probably underestimated the impact, the frequency of deliberate self-harm leading to traumatic cardiac arrest because we were unable to include cancellations, so patients with catastrophic injuries, beheadings, hemicorpectomies, etc., that we were cancelled on mostly, and these will mostly represent the very high energy impacts such as one-unders, train incidents, or falls from very, very high heights. And so they probably represent an underestimation and a skewing of our data. Okay, that's all I wanted to discuss with you today.